Most of us here today probably agree more or less on a couple of things. The first being that the current growth-oriented economy is not working. On the one hand, it has created so much environmental carnage that the viability of a livable planet hangs in the balance. In terms of just one planetary boundary alone, scientists tell us that we are likely to reach warming above pre-industrial temperatures of 1.5 degrees within the next few years. And beyond that, we are likely to reach tipping points when the cascading effects of climate change become unstoppable. On the other hand, inequity, social dislocation, and fracturing is spiraling out of control, destabilizing the very foundations of democracy in many countries. Nevertheless, the belief in the inviolability of growth is close to religious zealotry in our society, and the institutionalized economists and policymakers, buoyed by the blind optimism and hubris of our captains of industry, cling to the idea that we can have both growth and a livable planet through the wonders of green growth. This has become an unfortunate distraction, but one that is simply not supported by the empirical evidence, as Marta referenced this morning, and Mike and Jack. And if you would like to hear the arguments against green growth in one pocket-sized but explosive package, I cannot recommend more highly Timotei Parek's decimation of green growth at the recent Beyond Growth conference hosted by the European Parliament. The second thing most of us will likely agree on is that we need to move past a post-growth economic system that puts human well-being at its core and respects planetary boundaries. Which, of course, brings us to degrowth, why we are here today. As we know, degrowth is the planned reduction of resource and energy use in higher income nations, designed to bring our economies back into balance with the living world in a safe, just and equitable way. Degrowth advocates propose a suite of policies, including the scaling down of ecologically destructive industries, the decommodification of goods necessary to support well-being, such as public transport, healthcare, education, and electricity, and a shift from an ownership-oriented economy to one oriented around usership. But this inevitably brings us to the third thing that many of us are likely to agree on, and that is that moving from our current failing system to a new post-growth, well-being-centered economy will not be easy. As I have often noted, in a democratic system such as ours, where the electorate encompasses highly influential sectors with vested interests in the status quo, it has been difficult for successive governments to implement even modest climate mitigation policies. And what policies have been implemented, for example, the emissions trading scheme, have been so compromised that they have been rendered virtually ineffective. So, even for the eternal optimist, which I am on every second day, it is hard to see how we can get something as fundamentally transformative as a post-growth economy implemented. Where I have little doubt, however, is that at some point in the not too distant future, we will enter a post-growth state. It might be that as the signs of this future become impossible to ignore, through a series perhaps of systems failure, perhaps energy supply shocks, or a major disruption in other material supplies, another pandemic, or a collapse in financial markets, a far-sighted government will begin to institute a suite of policies that will put resiliency and well-being at the centre of our economy, setting us up for a future with some semblance of the necessary social infrastructure to support well-being. However, Even if this is some way off, there is a policy goal that we could begin to strive for, and I think there would be reasonable political appetite for across the political spectrum, even now. And that is sufficiency. And just noting here, thanks Jonathan for alerting me to this, I am not referring to sufficientarianism, a mouthful of a word, but also a theory of distributive justice and political philosophy. Though many of the principles encompassed by sufficientarianism, I challenge you to say that 10 times over very quickly, are well aligned with degrowth thinking. My discussion of sufficiency is in its more generic sense and is less theoretical or academic, more as a real and implementable policy goal. At the recent Beyond Growth conference hosted by the European Parliament, there were a host of experts presenting compelling arguments for a post-growth future, but one speech in particular got my attention. This was Yamuna Sahib, lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In her speech, she argued for sufficiency as a central policy objective for nations. She noted that France has to date been the only country to include sufficiency as a policy goal in its laws. But in its case, only in relation to energy. Apparently they're developing something around water too. And she noted how she's been working towards having this included in EU policies more generally. She noted how a policy of sufficiency would lead to an economy of well-being and, critically, an economy that provides for the needs of future generations by focusing on what is enough for the current ones. This struck me as a notion that people of all stripes, irrespective of where someone sits on the political spectrum, could coalesce and mobilise around. Those who lived through the Great Depression, probably not many of those around now, the world wars, and even perhaps the oil shocks of the 1970s will know what it means to strive for sufficiency. Indeed, for our grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation, this was simply the default. And a decade ago, one of our own politicians and thought leaders, Jeanette Fitzsimons, also urged us to embrace the idea of sufficiency through a series of eloquent writings and lectures on the economy of enough. But sadly, in the years since, rampant consumerism and profit-maximising, planet-plundering production, a little bit of alliteration there, appear to have only become more entrenched. We have become accustomed to just-in-time supply chains and having any number of a bamboozling number of product choices at our fingertips. We have become used to being able to buy out-of-season or exotic fruit at any time of year and to replacing our electronic or household appliances every few years, rather than having an expectation, as our grandparents did, that anything is repairable. This is not limited to consumer goods, of course. We are heavily dependent on global markets for our energy supply. And as Mike mentioned this morning, while we pride ourselves and crow about the fact that over 80% of our electricity comes from renewable sources, this is only our electricity. 60% of our energy supply comes from oil, gas, and coal, and most of this is imported. And it is important to remember that meanwhile, our per capita consumption of energy, also as Mike talked about this morning, which is very closely coupled with overall consumption, steadily and continues to increase, threefold since the 1960s. And while we focus on petrol, what we put in our cars, it is diesel that is the lifeblood of the economy. Diesel that enables goods and materials, including petrol, to be transported to wherever they need to be. We have already seen wobbles in diesel supply chains, which led to the government increasing requirements around minimum reserves to be held domestically. But let's think about food for a moment, everyone's favourite topic. To take one example, a few decades ago, and I thank Dave Kennedy for these figures, if you're here, Dave, the Southland region was able to supply, this is a few decades ago, about 80% of its own food needs. Now it barely provides 10%. This pattern is likely to be replicated throughout the country. On a national scale, our reliance on imported foods, including for things we consider staples, is growing. In 2001, New Zealand imported around $40 million worth of fruit and vegetables, $22 million worth of pork, about 60% of our consumption, and you can see on the slide why, and 75% of the grain in our bread. Over the past decades, under the control of the supermarket duopoly, which is the source of 80 to 90% of the food we consume, the food production and distribution system has become increasingly centralised to maximise efficiency and therefore profit rather than resilience. This system may work smoothly enough when there is no disruption, but the food security chickens come home to roost when we experience extreme weather or supply chain disruption. And we have amply seen this over the last couple of years with consequences for supply and cost of living. So, what might a national policy on sufficiency look like? In my newsroom article, I argued, somewhat playfully, but not entirely in jest, that the Productivity Commission, whose main goal is to get more out of our economy, natural resources and people, could be replaced by a Sufficiency Commission. A bit provocative, but why not? The fact that New Zealand, which is at the end of a long supply chain and will be at the end of the queue when any major supply disruptions arise, does not even have an energy security policy is frankly an astounding example of complacency and negligence on the part of successive governments. But the same could be said of food resilience. In recent decades, our food production system has become dominated by the production of cheap tradable commodities, aka milk powder, and maximisation of efficiency through the aggregation and centralisation of food production and distribution. All with profit as the core motive and completely losing sight of food resilience. So perhaps such a body, my new Commission for Sufficiency, could be put to work producing policy measures to increase our energy security and food resilience for a start. But aside from this, what might a suite of policies putting sufficiency above trade surpluses, share market performance, and maximisation of profit, corporate profit, look like? I think the incentives set for the market would be very, very different for a start. There would be a big role for regulation, no doubt. Policies to support localisation and bioregionalism would no doubt feature. And there would likely be much more space for cooperatives and other community-based systems to supply food, housing, and other needs. On her recent visit, economy policy expert Amanda Janou from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance remarked that we might start such conversations with one key question. What are the things that are critical to our well-being as a society? The response is likely to include sustainable energy, nutritious food, healthy housing, access to public transit, healthcare, and education. Those things we see on the inside of Kate Raworth's donut. Finally, one argument that we often hear is that we have to produce stuff that is destructive to our environment and has other adverse social costs, both intensive dairy and the forestry industry come to mind, because we have to produce enough export revenue to cover the cost of all the stuff we import. But what if we did not need to import all that stuff? I suspect countless shipping container loads of goods arriving in our ports every day do nothing to contribute to the well-being of ordinary New Zealanders. In fact, much of what we import and consume harms both our own well-being and our environment. So I look forward to the day we can get policy leaders across government agencies such as Treasury, MB, along with business, iwi and community leaders in a room, follow France's lead and begin work on policies that make sufficiency a central goal. And given that the New Zealand government is a member of the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, which Gareth might touch on a bit later, which I believe was instigated by Treasury, I would hope that there would be openness to this conversation. So just to finish, I will leave you with 2 quotes from a couple of ancient Greek fellows for us to reflect on, but acknowledging, of course, that we will find much more wisdom closer to home, especially from Te Ao Māori. Thank you.